Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview for the King's Digital English Language Teaching Special Interest Group. Today, we're joined by Nicky Hockly, who is the Director of Pedagogy at the Consultants E, an innovative online training and development organisation. Nicky has extensive experience in teaching and teacher training and is an established author in learning technologies and English language teaching. She's currently finishing a PhD at the University of Warwick, and we are very lucky to welcome you here today to share some of your knowledge and your experience with our group and others who may be interested in this video.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. And first of all, I'd like to consider about your extensive experience in English language teaching and digital technologies. And from that experience, which digital tools do you think have the most potential to impact language learning positively?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question to start with, I think. The question of, is there a technology or is there a best tool that can help us with teaching and learning is one that has been around for quite a while. I do need to start my answer, though, with a bit of a caveat around this. Essentially, the idea that there is one single best tool that will somehow solve the problem of language learning or education in general is something that we see around many learning technologies and the hype and so on, and the false promises that often go along with these technologies. So essentially, the idea that there is one tool that's going to, solve everything for us is often referred to as technological solutionism or techno-solutionism for short. And that's something I think we need to be very, very careful of. So I just want to flag that up. Now, how do we be aware or be careful about techno-solutionism? The answer, I think, is that we need to look at research. So when we want to identify a learning technology that does have potential for students and for us as teachers, we need to look at some of the research behind it. That's the first step. So for me, when I look at the research, one technology that I do think has promise is different forms of chatbots. So as you know, chatbots have been around in our field since, I don't know, the 1990s, I think. And of course, with generative AI, they've become far more, let's say, realistic. Earlier forms of chatbots were really quite limited. They were often working on predefined sorts of scripts. So if a learner tried to have a conversation, either in text form or later in voice, speaking form, these chatbots couldn't handle anything that went slightly off-piste or anything that was unexpected in the conversation. Now, if you've tried generative AI, you'll know that these new chatbots underpinned by generative AI are very good at holding conversations on pretty much any topic. So you can go off script and so on, and they can handle these twists and turns in conversations very well. So if we look at the research from decades of chatbot research, basically we find that one of the key problems was chatbots actually understanding what learners were saying, because as soon as they went out of specific parameters, the older chatbots couldn't handle it. The new ones can. This suggests, I think, quite a lot of promise, not only in terms of having more realistic conversations with chatbots for learners, but also keeping engagement going because of the very realistic conversations you can have, and also the ease of use in terms of simple interfaces and being able to interact in voice mode, not having to type everything out. So yeah, I mean, short answer then summarizing, I think chatbots underpinned by generative AI, especially those designed for language learners, do have potential, and we'll have to see what the research says around that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. And definitely, it's something that I think all of us have experienced when we're teaching in the classrooms, students talking about them to us and explaining, or us maybe even recommending things that they can do with them. And that kind of leads me into a book of yours that we actually used quite a lot in our digital English language teaching module at King's. And we got a lot of ideas to talk with students about. And I found that really helpful when I was teaching over the summer. And in this book, you mentioned about, the teacher's side and the teacher development. And you talked about how important it is for us teachers to enhance our own digital literacy in order to support students. And do you think that digital literacy is going to become a formal component of teacher training programs like the CELTA and Delta? And are there any strategies you might recommend for teachers to develop their digital literacy?
Yes, and again, digital literacies is an area that's been around for quite a while. And now, um, I think if you look at educational systems the world over, they are pretty much integrated into all curricula, at least on paper. The challenge, of course, is actually, as you suggest, for teachers to bring this into the classroom is where things get tricky. What does it mean to develop your students and your own digital literacies in practice? In terms of whether this should be a formal component, though, of teacher training courses, I mean, I think ideally it should be integrated into what we already do in teacher training courses, both pre-service and in-service. I mean, let's take a typical topic in a teacher training course, either at pre-service or in-service level. Teaching writing, right? This is something that's covered in all teacher training courses for language teachers. Um, if we're going to be teaching our students writing skills, why not look at online conventions for writing? Let's imagine that our students at some point in the future might want to set up like a personal website or maybe a blog or whatever it might be, but have some kind of presence online. If you're writing texts for online, you're probably going to want to include hyperlinks in your text. Now, conventions around hyperlinking are quite clear, like how many should you have? You don't want to write a text on a topic and have zero hyperlinks because it looks like you're not taking into account other, other views in the area or other knowledge that already exists in the area. But on the other hand, you don't want to have hyperlinks that are every 3 words because that actually makes the text extremely difficult to read. It's very, very distracting. So what does that mean? When we're teaching writing to our students, and this goes back to teacher training courses, we need to be aware of sort of online conventions like um, hyperlinking and also the use of images. So how many images are we including? What do the images look like? Where are we getting them from? Are we using Creative Commons images? All these sort of they are basically digital literacies, these information literacies that surround online writing can then be taught within the teacher training syllabus. So ideally, I think we shouldn't have digital literacies as a formal component, to get to your question. We should have it integrated into all of the things that we already teach on teacher training courses.
And I'd like to go back to what you were talking about before about the chatbots and the generative AI, because I've read an article that you wrote last year about called Artificial Intelligence in English Language Teaching, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as part of my research about chatbots and AI and how it can help in the classroom. And I know that you also have a new book coming out in November this year from Cambridge University Press that's 30 Essentials for Using AI, which is aimed at language teachers. So, do you think that it can help the teachers and learners? And is there anything that we need to be worried about?
Yes, yeah, also a great question. And as you know, having done some research yourself around AI and writing, it's kind of the big question, isn't it? It's for learners and for teachers. And certainly when ChatGPT was launched in November, was that 2023 or 2022? Might have been 2022. I can't remember now. But anyway,
Yes,
it
I
was,
think you're right. Yeah.
was 2023. Anyway, it was huge news absolutely everywhere. There was no getting away from it. But now the dust is starting to settle, I think. I mean, there's still plenty of hype around AI, but as always happens with new learning technologies or new technologies, the hype does die down. It is starting to die down a bit, although it's taking time. I do think that AI, generative AI, certainly can help teachers and learners. I mean, some of the obvious benefits for teachers, for those of you who've actually tried it, are, for example, help with lesson planning. So, for example, when I was researching for the book that you just mentioned on AI, I used ChatGPT because I actually wrote this book a year ago. So it was one of the main tools that was around. I used ChatGPT to generate some lessons for me. And I put in prompts that I thought would be slightly unusual, like, for example, what are the effects of e-waste on Ghana, right? This is not something you come across usually in a textbook, in a course book, but it's something quite specific. And as a CELTA and Delta trainer myself, looking at the lesson plans that were generated, they were pretty good. I was quite impressed. You had your typical communicative approach. You had your little intro, a little bit of personalization, then you had some input, in the form of a text or some sort of thing was suggested for input. Then you had comprehension questions, which were gist, and then for content, and then you had some sort of production, often discussion in groups and so on. So it sort of followed this very standard communicative lesson approach, which I thought, this is not bad. I mean, certainly for CELTA level pre-service trainees, this is a solid lesson. And for Delta in-service trainees, yeah, not bad. You might want to tweak it a little bit. So certainly in terms of lesson planning, I think it can help teachers a lot. It's massively time consuming, time saving, not consuming, time saving in that respect. And also, if you think about differentiation in materials, everybody has learners of different abilities in their classes. You might want to have a slightly simpler reading text for some of your learners, or extra, work to do for the more advanced learners. And you can create versions around materials like that, differentiate around materials through these tools really, really easily and really quickly. So that's great as well, time saving. And the other area I think that's a benefit for teachers is, of course, in providing feedback and also possibly an assessment. Well, that's a whole separate topic that we could spend hours talking about. So benefits for teachers for sure. Benefits for learners, of course, we talked about speaking practice, also pronunciation improvement, and then also in terms of understanding and helping with brainstorming ideas, working through complex concepts and so on. I think there's potential there as well.
So the last part that we were going to talk about is, are there any concerns or things we should be worried about with AI?
Absolutely, and I have just as much to say about that because I think we need to be critical users of AI. This is the first thing. So the book that you referenced earlier, the kind of the middle section of that is called The Big Questions, which I think are the questions that we need to ask around our use of AI. So that would include things that have also been in the press and that we've all heard about, such as bias. Talk about that in a second. Accessibility, so who can access these new AI tools, who's excluded, issues around the privacy of data and the ownership of data. So, for example, if you're a teacher, maybe you're uploading a student's essay to get some feedback on that, or a student is uploading their essay. Where is that data going? Who's keeping it? What are the rights around this ownership? So, data ownership. And also, of course, the big question around copyright and content, because as you know, these these generative AI large language models have been trained on massive amounts of data that were just scraped from the internet without permission. So, my old blog from 2005 was probably in there, and anything that you might have produced, Rebecca, if it was online and available, it's just been hoovered up by these large language models and kind of smushed into the mix there and used for training without any permission from us. So that is a huge issue, and there are lawsuits going on, as you know, around this issue as well. So yeah, I think the basic line here is that we have to become critical users of AI and help our students to become critical users too.
Yeah, thank you. You did touch on a lot of different issues, and you're right, we could talk about all of them for a very long time. But I think there are things that, as teachers, we need to be aware of, those things about copyright or bias, or where is the data going when we put it in. So we need to think about that. If we're putting students' work into there, we have to have permission and understand exactly what's happening with the data. So thank you for explaining those. And I think they're things that we think about more as time goes on, like you said, with the research. And I'd like to move on to a slightly different topic, which is about the digital divide and how it affects English language learning in different regions. So, how do you think that teachers that are in low resource settings can leverage technology effectively given the constraints that they face?
Yes, I suppose, I mean, the digital divide is an interesting term, isn't it? Because it sort of suggests that we can divide people into those that have and those that don't. There's an idea of a divide. I think it's probably more useful to think of this as a sort of a continuum, right, in terms of access. But digital exclusion is certainly an important thing. And it's often associated with learners in the global south, right? Often in underprivileged or isolated, let's say, rural communities and so on. But I think it's also important for us to remember that it can include immigrant and refugee populations in the global north. And it can also include older citizens or underserved minority populations. So, for example, I was just reading some research recently around older populations, especially from lower socioeconomic statuses in the global north, and that included Singapore, which is a highly technological society, in Singapore, and the US, where we also have racial minorities who have unequal access. So we have age, we have gender, we have race, we have all of this, which can influence the so-called divide or digital exclusion. In terms of where to start, I think just recently in digital literacies, this is an area that I've been working on for quite a while with my co-authors, Mark Pegram and Gavin Dudney. Recently, we've added to a digital literacies framework that we've added a concept called zero literacy. Now, zero literacy it's what it sounds like. It's essentially it's kind of a functional or basic operational literacy, or almost a pre-literacy skill. So things like being able to switch on a computer or type on a keyboard or move a mouse, which, to us probably sounds like, well, we all know how to do that. Well, it turns out we don't. Knowing how to connect to the internet, assuming you have internet access, or how to open a browser, these kinds of very, very basic operational literacies or zero literacies. These precede everything else, and they have to be in place before we can start talking about, addressing digital exclusion and so on. Another really interesting concept here, I think, apart from the concept of zero literacy, is this idea of jagged learner profiles, which I'm sure you've heard about as well in terms of linguistic ability. So, for example, you might be really good at writing in a foreign language, but you're not so good at speaking. So you have this jagged profile, a high level in writing and a lower level in speaking. That's a term that's been around for a while. But this idea of a jagged profile also can be applied to digital literacies and digital literacy profiles. So, for example, I sort of came across this. We were doing some teacher training in Nigeria about using really basic sort of, trying to help teachers in rural areas in Nigeria develop some digital literacy skills. And we had some face-to-face training, and the teachers, came to a venue, and what was really, really eye-opening was this fact that some of the teachers in the room had never used a computer before. They all came with their mobile phones. This was interesting. So it's this idea of a jagged profile. So yeah, you can use your mobile phone. Maybe you use WhatsApp or whatever it is, or you take photos. So you know how to use certain functions on your mobile phone. And depending on whether it's a smartphone or, in this case, a kind of low-level basic mobile phone, those are also going to restrict the literacies that you have in place. But in terms of computer literacies, there was clear evidence there of zero literacies. And of course, computers are used in things like jobs, email writing, and so on. So they have different functions, and they're a kind of an access, let's say, a door to access to perhaps white-collar jobs. So these kinds of concerns are really important, and they're nuanced, and they're complex, and they have to do with wider systemic inequalities.
How do you think the teachers that are in these lower resource settings can use technologies effectively?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Yes, absolutely. I think the first thing to do is to work with learners' essential digital literacies first. So that might include zero literacy, assuming that there are computers, available in the context. But perhaps more importantly, if mobile devices are the only device that's available, that's fine. Low-end devices, whatever they might be, is to start with basic digital literacies like information literacy. So, going back to AI. Certainly, in some contexts, there's no way that learners are going to have access to AI or want to interact with it, but they are very likely to come across AI-generated content online, assuming they have internet access, right? So this idea of being able to, basic information literacy, which is to look at sources, interrogate, be a critical consumer of digital information, essentially. That's information literacy. That's the first part. Um, of course, there are contexts, like we were just saying, where maybe there is no, even accessibility, never mind devices, there's nothing. And I think we still need to focus on digital literacies here. And this involves teachers explaining, what these things are, what's out there, and case studies, I think, is a particularly good way to do this. So case studies that are relevant to the context. So if we're talking about Nigeria, just because this happens to be my experience, we're going to use examples that are relevant to Nigeria, not to, Singapore. It wouldn't make much sense. And of course, these kinds of digital literacies do need to be integrated within the curriculum, I think, even in contexts where there may be no access to devices or internet connections.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting to just think about how being context specific is really the most important thing for teachers, and also thinking about what their students need to understand, not just what they need to do because of their exposure to the internet and AI generated content and all those things. That's a really interesting perspective I didn't consider, actually. Thank you. And before we finish, I'd just like to ask a question that's kind of looking towards the future and how you envision the future of technology in English language teaching over the next decade or so.
Yeah, that's always a really hard question. What does the future hold? I think definitely more AI. That is definitely not going away. I do remember doing a webinar about a year ago, and one of the participants asked me if AI was a passing fad. I'm absolutely not. I mean, yeah, it's here to stay, a bit like mobile devices. Although, of course, AI is not a device, it's a software. Yes, I think the hype around AI will die down a bit. I think we will learn to be critical users of it. Okay, so yes, I think AI is going to be around for the foreseeable future, as in forever, and we will learn to integrate it, I think, more effectively, and also integrate it into our classes to help our students use AI as critical users, and also as a tool to help them learning. I don't think there's any point in trying to pretend it's not there and trying to ignore it. When I was writing the AI book that you mentioned earlier, the last chapter is exactly this. The question is like, what does the future hold? So I started looking around a little bit, and I came across the most amazingly named field, which is paleofuturology. Isn't that great? Makes me think I should have studied that at university. Paleofuturology is essentially looking at how the past represented the future, right? And an interesting example here is, for example, in the 1950s, right? People writing in the 1950s could very clearly predict that plastics would become increasingly widespread, for example, in households, right? But when you look at the sort of advertisements at the time around, plastic is the new future thing, and people writing about plastics, and it in the context of households, they tend to still see women as people who would be doing all of the shopping and all of the cleaning. There was no possible conception that gender roles might change in terms of, household chores and so on. So I think it's interesting because technology affects attitudes and norms, right? It shapes our expectations across various aspects of our lives. Something like internet dating is now widely accepted. That was pretty unthinkable. And in fact, we even now have AI companions. You can download an app onto your phone, which can then be your boyfriend or your girlfriend. Um, and these are widely used, so it may sound mad, but it's there, and it fulfills the need for people. So I think in terms of our profession, teachers and learners, we already use a wide range of technology tools, right, in our teaching and in our learning. And I think we're going to see more generative AI, just because it's going to be so much a part of our lives, and it's going to continue to sort of shape our expectations really, and our needs. So short answer, what I see is more AI integrated into everything that we do, and we need to be critical about it, critical users.
Yeah, that's an amazing answer, and is very similar to the answer I found in my MA research from the English for Academic Purposes practitioners. They're talking a lot about how we need to be really critical and use our evaluation of the tools and things that we're using, and is it really helping our learning, and are we missing anything when we're teaching with these tools. So that's an amazing answer that seems to be agreeing with the other academics at the moment. So thank you very much. I think we can finish there for today. So thank you so much for spending some time to talk about all of those things with me. And I know that the digital ELT group at King's, and also that others who will watch this video will gain a lot from hearing what your answers for those questions. So thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Rebecca. I really enjoyed our chat. Thank you.
Thank you.